Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at this LinkedIn article. It's called Trump's Victory, America's Revolt Against Prosecutorial Abuse.
Wow.
It's by David Vogel.
Yeah, I saw that one.
Have you heard of him?
I haven't, no.
So he's a retired CEO, but he also founded a religious organization. And his main argument in this article is that Trump's recent win, the election, wasn't really just about Trump himself. It was a sign of something much bigger going on. Like people are losing faith in the American justice system. What stood out to you from this article?
Well, I think his central argument is pretty interesting. He's saying the American justice system, it's so weighed down by all these vague laws and these aggressive tactics by prosecutors that it's become, well, he actually calls it a system of legalized annihilation, and that this is really hurting ordinary citizens.
Legalized annihilation, that's pretty strong statement.
Yeah.
And he uses this term over-criminalization to describe this problem. What exactly does that mean?
Basically, over-criminalization, it's about how many laws we have in the U.S. Thousands of federal laws, and then all these regulations that can land you in trouble with the law. And the problem is they're often vague and they overlap. And so Vogel is saying that this makes it, really easy to break the law without even realizing it. In fact, he mentions this book, 3 Felonies a Day. And it says that, like, the average American, just going about their day, they probably commit, like, multiple felonies each day.
3 felonies a day? That's kind of scary, to be honest. I mean, how can anyone keep track of all these rules without messing up?
Yeah, it's like walking through a minefield. Vogel is saying that because there are so many laws, prosecutors don't really have to look for crimes. They could just choose someone and then, dig into their life until they find something, anything to use against them.
So it's not about justice, it's about power.
Exactly.
That's pretty disturbing. I know Vogel talks about a few real-life cases to show this, right?
Yeah, and I think those cases are really important for us to understand how this affects real people.
One of those cases that stuck with me was the story of Khalif Browder. Can you remind everyone about what happened to him and what it tells us about these problems with the justice system?
Yeah, Khalif Browder, it's a really sad story. He was only 16 when he got accused of stealing a backpack. They arrested him, and he spent 3 years in jail. Imagine that, 3 years. Yeah, and 2 of those years, he was in solitary confinement.
3 years in jail, and he hadn't even had a trial.
No trial.
So they basically punished him before even knowing if he was guilty.
He always said he was innocent, the whole time. And in the end, they just let him go without ever charging him with anything. But the damage was done. He couldn't cope with what he went through. He actually took his own life not long after he got out.
It's heartbreaking. The system that's supposed to protect people ended up destroying him. There was another case that I found really interesting, the bunny farm raid.
Oh, yeah.
What do you make of that one?
Caleb Smith and his rabbits. At first it sounds kind of funny, but it's actually a really disturbing story. This teenager, he was raising rabbits to help pay for college. And then one day, federal agents just raided his farm.
What was the reason?
They said he didn't have the right licenses.
So they weren't concerned about animal cruelty or anything, just paperwork.
It doesn't seem like it. There was no sign that he was mistreating the animals. But they still took his rabbits and slapped him with huge fines. Basically, they destroyed his dream.
That just seems so excessive. It's like they were just flexing their bureaucratic muscles.
Yeah, and I think Vogel is trying to show us how this kind of bureaucratic overreach can happen to anyone, even a kid trying to run a small business. The system can be so unpredictable and harsh.
And it seems like they prioritize the rules over, common sense and fairness.
Right.
Vogel also mentions Richard Jewell, the security guard who was wrongly accused in the Atlanta Olympics bombing. Why do you think he included that case?
I think it's a powerful reminder of how the media and the desire for a quick arrest can totally overshadow the truth and ruin innocent lives. Remember, at first, Jewell was a hero. He saved so many lives.
Yeah, everyone was praising him for his bravery.
But then the FBI started suspecting him. They thought he planted the bomb, and the media just went crazy. They portrayed him as this dangerous criminal.
But he was innocent, right?
Oh, yeah. They eventually cleared him, but it was too late. His reputation was shattered. He had to live with that suspicion hanging over him for the rest of his life.
It's like the system failed him twice. First, by wrongly accusing him, and then by not protecting him from the media frenzy, even though he was innocent.
Exactly.
And then there's the case of Andy Johnson, the Wyoming farmer who got into trouble over a pond on his property.
Ah, yes. Andy Johnson and his pond. It really shows how these obscure regulations can be used against ordinary people. He built a pond on his farm, to water his livestock. It's just common sense for a farmer.
Yeah, basic necessity.
But then the EPA got involved. They said he violated the Clean Water Act and threatened him with millions of dollars in fines if he didn't get rid of the pond.
Millions of dollars for a pond. That's insane.
It shows you the power dynamic. You have this farmer going up against a huge federal agency. He ended up fighting them in court for years. He eventually won, but it cost him a lot of money and stress.
So another victory, but at a huge personal cost.
It makes you wonder if the system is even designed to be fair.
It feels more like it's designed to wear people down.
Yeah.
So we've talked about these individual cases, but they all seem to point to a bigger problem, a system that's not really working.
I think you're right. They're not just isolated incidents. They're all connected.
It's like Vogel is saying, all this is creating a climate of distrust, maybe even a rebellion against the justice system. People feel like the system is rigged against them.
And that's where his analysis of Trump's election comes in. He's suggesting that this feeling of injustice is what led people to vote for Trump, even though he had his own legal issues.
So it wasn't necessarily about supporting Trump himself, but more about rejecting the system.
Yeah, it was a vote against a system that people see as unfair. And Vogel thinks this should be a wake-up call. We need some serious changes. Hashtag TTS The Deep Dive episode 2024-1201, part 2 of 3.
Yeah, it's like a protest vote. People are so fed up with the system that they're willing to try anything different.
Exactly. And that frustration is totally understandable when you think about how many laws there are and how complicated they are, which brings us back to this idea of over-criminalization. It's not just the number of laws, it's also the fact that a lot of them are written in such a vague way.
Right. We talked about that earlier. Vogel says that these vague laws give prosecutors way too much power to basically interpret them however they want.
He does, and he actually quotes Justice Scalia, Antonin Scalia.
Oh, it's interesting.
Scalia was worried about this idea of prosecuting people for crimes that are, not even clearly defined.
Mm-hmm.
He said it could lead to a system where you get punished for breaking rules that don't really exist.
It's like something out of Kafka, You're constantly afraid of breaking some rule that you don't even know about.
Exactly. Vague laws are dangerous because they can be twisted and used in ways that were never intended. It leaves people vulnerable to prosecutors who want to abuse their power.
And Vogel brings up the case of John Yates, the fisherman who got in trouble over some undersized fish.
Oh, yeah, John Yates. That's a perfect example of how a law that was meant for one thing can be totally misused. Yates was prosecuted under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act.
Wait, wasn't that law about financial fraud? What does that have to do with fishing?
You'd think it wouldn't, right? But the prosecutor said that when Yates threw those undersized fish back into the sea, he was destroying evidence to obstruct a federal investigation. They basically tried to say that the fish were like financial documents.
Throwing fish back became like shredding evidence.
That's what they were arguing. Crazy, right? The Supreme Court eventually sided with Yates, but not before he had to spend years fighting this case and probably a lot of money on lawyers.
It just shows you that even if you're innocent, the legal process itself can be incredibly damaging. It goes back to that power imbalance we were discussing.
Absolutely. Most people don't have the resources to fight these kinds of battles.
And then there's this whole issue of civil asset forfeiture, which Vogel calls robbery by the government. That's a pretty strong accusation. Can you explain how that works and why Vogel is so critical of it?
So, civil asset forfeiture allows the government to take your property if they think it's connected to some kind of criminal activity. And the crazy thing is, you don't even have to be charged with a crime, let alone convicted.
So they can just assume your property is guilty until you prove it innocent.
Pretty much. All they need is a suspicion. And then it's up to you to prove that your property wasn't involved in anything illegal.
Doesn't that go against the whole idea of due process?
It does. And Vogel argues that this mainly hurts people who can't afford to hire lawyers to fight back. It just makes the power imbalance of the system even worse. He uses a couple of cases to show how unfair this can be.
Like the Caswell family and the Sorvalese family.
Right. The Caswells owned a motel in Massachusetts. And the government tried to seize their property because some guests had used rooms for drug deals.
So the owners were being punished even though they had nothing to do with the drug dealing.
They were being punished just for running a business. It took them years to keep their property. They had to pay a ton of legal fees, and it was really stressful for them.
And what about the Sorvalese family?
Their teenage son sold some drugs on their porch, and the government tried to evict the whole family from their home.
That's so extreme. Punishing the whole family for something their son did? It's totally disproportionate.
That's exactly Vogel's point. Civil asset forfeiture laws can be incredibly unjust. They target innocent people and take away their property without any real due process.
It creates this environment where people are afraid of the government because they feel like they have no power to protect themselves. And Vogel seems to be saying that this fear and powerlessness are part of the reason why people are so dissatisfied with the justice system in general.
He is. And it's not just him. There are a lot of people from all different political backgrounds who are concerned about this erosion of due process and the fact that prosecutors have too much power.
So if Vogel is right, and this distrust in the justice system is really driving the current political climate, what can we do to fix it? How can we make the system more fair and regain the public's trust?
That's a tough question, but Vogel does have some ideas. Some of them are pretty radical, but he thinks they could help restore balance to the justice system and make people believe in it again. Hashtag TTS The Deep Dive Episode 2024-1201, Part 3.
Okay, so what are these radical solutions? How does Vogel propose we fix this broken system?
Well, he's not talking about small changes. He says we need a complete overhaul, like we need to rethink the whole way the justice system works. And he says we need to start by looking at how resources are allocated.
What do you mean?
Well, think about the difference between prosecutors and public defenders. Prosecutors have tons of resources, but public defenders are often overworked and underfunded. They can't always give their clients the best defense.
So it's like an unfair fight from the start.
Right. And Vogel says we need to give public defenders a lot more funding so they can actually do their job properly.
To make it a fair fight.
Exactly. And he also says we need to hold prosecutors accountable when they abuse their power.
Yeah, it seems like there's not much stopping them from doing that now.
Exactly. Vogel thinks we need stricter rules and more oversight to make sure prosecutors are actually following the law themselves.
They should be held to the same standards as everyone else.
Right. And finally, he says we need to make the laws clearer and simpler so that ordinary people can understand them.
So we can avoid all this confusion and over-criminalization.
Exactly. It's about making the law transparent and accessible to everyone, not just lawyers.
It's been really eye-opening to dive into this topic. You see these stories in the news, but Vogel's article really helps you understand the bigger picture.
It's important to look beyond the headlines and see how these individual stories are connected to the way the system works.
It's like he's showing us the hidden side of the justice system, and it's not always pretty.
No, it's not. It shows that even though the system is supposed to be about justice, it doesn't always live up to that ideal.
So where do we go from here? If Vogel is right, and there really is this kind of uprising against the justice system, what can we do to fix it?
I think the first step is to talk about it. We need to have these conversations and really understand the problems. We need to demand that our leaders are transparent and accountable. And we need to support the people and organizations who are trying to reform the system.
It sounds like a call to action.
It is. We can't just sit around and complain. We need to get involved and make our voices heard.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive today for this important conversation.
Remember, the more you know about the systems that affect your life, the better prepared you are to make a difference.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. We'll see you next time.